He had seen every kind of performance imaginable, but when this woman walked onto the stage carrying words that had been stolen from her by stroke, yet somehow transformed into something more beautiful than language itself, Simon Cowell realized he was about to witness something that would redefine what it means to find voice when words have been taken away. The America's Got Talent theater hummed with familiar energy, but tonight there was an undercurrent of linguistic curiosity mixed with profound empathy, as if the audience sensed they were about to experience something that challenged their understanding of communication, creativity, and the relationship between brain damage and artistic expression. Her name was Dr. Catherine Hayes, 41 years old, walking slowly but confidently towards center stage despite carrying the weight of a neurological condition that had transformed her relationship with language in ways that medical science was still struggling to understand. In her hands, she carried a small notebook filled with symbols, marks, and fragments that had evolved into something entirely new. Catherine had been a literature professor at Columbia University, specializing in contemporary poetry, when a massive stroke at age 39 had damaged the language centers of her brain, leaving her with severe expressive aphasia. She could understand words perfectly when others spoke them, but her own ability to produce coherent speech had been devastated, reducing her verbal expression to fragments and grammatical chaos. Catherine wore a simple blue dress and carried herself with the careful dignity of someone who had learned to navigate a world where her intelligence remained intact, but her ability to express it through conventional language had been profoundly altered. Catherine's journey had begun not with her stroke, but with a remarkable discovery during rehabilitation. While working with speech therapists, Catherine had noticed that she could still produce fluent, articulate expression when she spoke in rhythm, when her damaged language centers were supported by the musical processing areas of her brain that had remained intact. Catherine's case represents one of the most fascinating examples of neuroplasticity we've documented. Dr. Sarah Martinez, her neurologist, had explained to colleagues. Her stroke damaged traditional language areas, but her musical processing centers were unaffected. She's developed a new form of communication that bridges poetry and music. The phenomenon had first been discovered 6 months into recovery, during a particularly difficult therapy session. Catherine had become so frustrated with her inability to form coherent sentences that she had begun crying, and her tears had somehow unlocked a rhythmic pattern of speech that allowed complex, beautiful expression to flow from her damaged language centers. When Catherine speaks in musical patterns, her aphasia essentially disappears, Dr. Martinez had noted. She's not just recovering her ability to communicate, she's developing an entirely new form of poetic expression that combines academic precision with musical emotional power. As rehabilitation progressed, Catherine's rhythmic speech had become increasingly sophisticated, evolving from simple therapeutic exercises into complex poetic compositions that seemed to access language capabilities that her damaged brain couldn't reach through conventional neural pathways. Catherine's post-stroke poetry is more powerful than her academic work ever was, observed Dr. Robert Kim, a linguistics professor. Her brain damage forced her to find new pathways that access more fundamental, more emotionally resonant forms of expression. Catherine had initially been devastated by her condition, mourning not just her lost ability to speak normally, but her identity as someone whose life had been built around sophisticated verbal communication. But as her rhythmic speech developed, Catherine began to understand that her stroke had revealed hidden musical dimensions of expression. I discovered that my damaged brain could access forms of poetic truth that my intact brain had never reached. Catherine had explained through her rhythmic speech patterns. The stroke didn't just change how I speak, it changed what I can say, how deeply I can express essential human experiences. Catherine's rhythmic poetry had begun attracting attention from both medical and literary communities. Poets were amazed by the innovative forms her brain damage had created, while researchers were fascinated by her demonstration that aphasia could enhance rather than simply diminish communicative capability. But Catherine's most remarkable discovery was that her rhythmic poetry seemed to have therapeutic effects, not just for her own communication, but for other people dealing with language disorders, trauma, and emotional distress. When she performed her compositions, listeners often reported experiencing emotional release and connection that conventional poetry couldn't provide. Standing now backstage at AGT, Catherine felt the familiar rhythm beginning to pulse through her consciousness, the musical patterns that would allow her damaged language centers to access sophisticated expression that remained trapped behind her aphasia when she tried to speak conventionally. Tonight, she would demonstrate that stroke could create rather than destroy artistic capability, that brain damage could reveal hidden musical dimensions of language, and that neurological trauma could produce forms of communication that transcended the limitations of both damaged and intact neural networks. The audience's reaction was immediate empathy mixed with curiosity. Here was someone whose bearing suggested both a vulnerability and extraordinary strength, someone who had clearly survived something devastating, but had transformed that survival into something beautiful. "Hello," Simon said, gently, recognizing that communication might require special patience. Catherine took a breath, and when she spoke, her voice carried the distinctive rhythm that marked her post-stroke expression, flowing, musical patterns that carried meaning through rhythm and melody as much as through words. "My name is Catherine Hayes," she began, her speech following musical patterns that made her meaning clear despite the unconventional cadence. "I come to show you that broken brains can make more beautiful words than whole ones ever dreamed." Simon felt something shift in his understanding. This wasn't going to be about overcoming disability. This was someone who had discovered that neurological trauma could create rather than destroy artistic possibility. 2 years ago, stroke took my professor words, my lecture language, but left me with rhythm, with musical meaning, with poetry that my whole brain could never reach, Catherine continued, her rhythmic speech gaining confidence. "I am here tonight to share what my damaged mind discovered, that broken language can become more true, more deep than perfect speech ever was." The audience was captivated not just by Catherine's story, but by the hypnotic quality of her rhythmic expression, which seemed to carry emotional content in ways that conventional speech couldn't achieve. "Tonight I will perform for you neurological poetry, brain damage verse that exists only because my language centers were forced to find new paths to truth." One judge asked gently, "Catherine, can you help us understand how your condition affects your ability to create poetry?" "My stroke took away my ability to speak the way professors speak in careful sentences, but it gave me access to the musical mind, the rhythmic brain that lives beneath ordinary language," Catherine responded. "When I speak in rhythm, my damaged brain can create poetry more powerful than my intact mind ever produced." The stroke didn't steal my voice. It revealed a deeper voice I never knew I had. Simon was fascinated by the combination of intellectual sophistication and emotional directness that Catherine's rhythmic speech achieved. "Catherine, can you show us what this neurological poetry sounds like?" Catherine positioned herself at center stage and opened her notebook, but it became clear that her performance would be more about rhythmic expression than reading written text. She closed her eyes briefly, allowing the musical patterns that governed her post-stroke communication to take control. This is called After the Storm, and it tells the story of how my broken brain learned to sing. What followed was unlike anything the AGT audience had ever experienced. Catherine's performance combined spoken word poetry with musical expression, creating communication that was part literature, part song, part rhythmic incantation that seemed to reach directly into listeners' emotional centers Words fell apart like autumn leaves scattered by the windstorm. In my head, Professor Language, blown away, leaving only rhythm, only heartbeat, only the music that words were always trying to become. Catherine's rhythmic poetry continued, describing her journey from academic discourse to neurological verse with images that were both intellectually complex and emotionally immediate. I used to teach students about metaphor, about literary device, never knowing that the best poetry lives in the broken spaces between intention and expression, between the word we want and the word that comes when language learns to dance. As her performance progressed, Catherine's rhythmic patterns became increasingly complex, demonstrating that her aphasia had not limited her expressive capability, but had revealed entirely new forms of poetic communication. My stroke was not an ending, but a beginning, not a loss, but a discovery that perfect speech is just the starting place for the real conversation between heart and tongue, between the broken brain and the song. It learns to sing. The audience was mesmerized by Catherine's performance, which seemed to bypass normal language processing to create direct emotional impact. Her rhythmic poetry worked on listeners at levels that conventional verse couldn't reach. Catherine's final composition addressed the audience directly. We are all walking around phrased with perfect words that say nothing, but listen to the rhythm underneath, the music that your heart has always been trying to speak. When Catherine finished, the theater remained in profound silence as the audience processed the revelation that brain damage could create, rather than destroy, artistic capability. Then applause began, not usual entertainment appreciation, but recognition that follows genuine artistic revelation, acknowledgement of having witnessed something that expanded understanding of human potential. Simon stood up, understanding that Catherine had demonstrated something far more significant than recovery from stroke. She had proven that neurological differences could become sources of artistic innovation, that brain damage could reveal hidden communicative gifts. Catherine, Simon said, walking onto the stage, what you've just shared challenges everything I thought I knew about language, creativity, and the relationship between brain damage and artistic capability. You've discovered that your neurological trauma created access to forms of expression that your intact brain could never have achieved. Catherine's rhythmic response carried both gratitude and insight. I learned that my stroke was not a thief, but a teacher, that the broken places or in our minds are often where new forms of beauty can grow. As the golden buzzer activated, Simon said, Catherine, you've proven that the most powerful poetry might come not from perfect language centers, but from places where those centers learn to sing in entirely new ways. 6 months later, Catherine established the Neurological Poetry Institute, teaching people with brain injuries to discover musical possibilities within their changed neural networks. Her techniques proved valuable not just for aphasia recovery, but for anyone seeking alternative forms of expression. Catherine's work attracted attention from both medical and literary communities. Rehabilitation centers began incorporating her rhythmic poetry techniques into therapy programs, while universities explored how brain damage could enhance rather than diminish creative capability. Years later, Catherine's rhythmic poetry had evolved into increasingly complex forms, suggesting that her brain continued to discover new pathways between damaged language centers and intact musical processing areas. The echo poet who found new voice in rhythmic verse had demonstrated that stroke could create rather than destroy expressive capability, that brain damage could reveal hidden musical dimensions of language, and that the most powerful communication might emerge from the intersection of neurological trauma and creative courage. The AGT episode featuring Catherine became a phenomenon in both medical and literary circles, generating unprecedented interest in the relationship between brain injury and artistic expression. Neurological rehabilitation centers reported increased enrollment in programs exploring creative approaches to aphasia recovery. Catherine fundamentally changed how we understand the relationship between language damage and creative potential, explained Dr. Martinez during a conference on innovative stroke recovery. She proved that neurological trauma could enhance, rather than simply diminish, communicative capability. The Neurological Poetry Institute expanded to 12 countries, with programs adapted to different languages and cultural contexts, while maintaining core principles of rhythmic expression. Catherine's techniques were translated into multiple languages, demonstrating universal applications of musical language processing. Dr. James Rodriguez, a speech therapist in Madrid, began incorporating Catherine's methods with Spanish-speaking stroke patients. When we introduced rhythmic poetry, patients who had been silent for months began expressing complex emotions through musical speech patterns, he reported. The Institute developed specialized programs for different types of brain injury. Veterans with traumatic brain injuries learned to use rhythmic expression to process combat trauma, while children with developmental language disorders discovered alternative pathways through musical speech. 3 years after AGT, Catherine's work attracted attention from artificial intelligence researchers studying natural language processing. Her demonstration that damaged brains could create more expressive communication influenced development of AI systems prioritizing emotional resonance over grammatical perfection. Catherine's most groundbreaking project involved working with families affected by stroke. Her techniques helped both patients and caregivers develop new forms of emotional communication that strengthened relationships rather than being hindered by language barriers. "My husband had a stroke that left him unable to speak normally," explained caregiver Susan Thompson. Catherine taught us rhythmic conversation techniques that allowed communication with more emotional depth than we'd ever achieved before his injury. 5 years later, Catherine published Broken Speech, Beautiful Song, which became essential reading for speech therapists, poets, and anyone interested in the intersection of neurology and creativity. The book included audio recordings alongside scientific explanations of the neuroplasticity involved. Catherine's most innovative development was creating neural bridges, rhythmic patterns that helped stroke survivors gradually transition from musical expression back to conventional speech, while maintaining access to emotional depth that rhythmic communication provided. The Institute's therapeutic applications extended to psychiatric hospitals, where Catherine's rhythmic techniques helped patients with mental health conditions find new pathways to emotional expression when traditional therapy had been ineffective. Years later, Catherine's rhythmic abilities became increasingly sophisticated. Her latest compositions incorporated jazz improvisation, classical meter, and contemporary spoken word, suggesting that her neuroplasticity was continuing to create new forms of expression. Catherine's influence extended into mainstream education, where teachers began incorporating rhythmic expression techniques to help all students access deeper levels of emotional and creative communication. The woman who found music in broken words had created a global movement toward understanding brain injury as potential enhancement rather than just loss, proving that profound expression might emerge when neurological trauma forces discovery of entirely new pathways to meaning. Catherine continued performing while training healthcare professionals to recognize musical possibilities within language differences. Her greatest satisfaction came from knowing that stroke survivors worldwide were discovering their language changes as doorways to forms of expression their intact brains could never have accessed.